I'm Tim, the brand weaver, and this is Branding for Breweries, the podcast that helps you grow your brewery, build a better brand, and connect with more drinkers. Each week, I'm joined by the brightest minds in the beer world, sharing practical tips to help your brewery stand out and sell more beer. Let's get stuck in. What up, 24-hour party people? 'Tis I, Tim the Brand Weaver, and you are listening to Branding for Breweries, the show that, as the intro says, brings you the brightest, most attractive people from the beer world to your earballs and eyeballs in the hope that their little nuggets of wisdom will fall out of their mouth and into your brains so your breweries can do the very best with it as well. And today is no exception because I am joined by a gentleman that I've spoken to multiple times across LinkedIn, bumped into him at several events, but never really got the chance to sit down and pick his brains. But now it is happening. This is Giles, head of brand at Hall Woodhouse. And if you don't know the Hall Woodhouse name, you will know Badger and Outland. We've got Cask and Keg under one roof, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. You brewers might be sat there listening going, well, I've got a decent cask brewery, or oh, I've got a decent keg brewery, but you might be looking at dipping and diving into the other offering. So hopefully Giles is going to wax lyrical, share a load of his wisdom, and you can take away some saucy tidbits to help inspire you moving forward. So without further ado, let's bring Giles to the stage. Giles! Ah!
Hi Tim, how you doing? That's quite the intro.
Dude, as I've said to other guests, I like to lead with high energy because I want to set the bar. Now you're going, oh my God, I have to match this and hope for the best for the rest of the show.
We'll be okay. We'll get somewhere.
Thank you, mate. Dead excited for this conversation because I know several breweries who are considering or, dipping their toes into the magical balancing act, which is Cask and Keg. And of course, yourself, you've trod the path, you've done the journey, and this is what we're going to be talking about today. But I suppose for those people who may not be familiar with yourself or potentially Outland or Badger or Hall Woodhouse, would you mind giving a quick whistle-stop overview as to who you are, where do you come from, and what do you do?
Yeah, of course. So, as you say, my name's Giles Mountford. I'm the head of brand at Hall Woodhouse, which means looking after the beer brands rather than the hospitality part of the business, which has its own sort of marketing team. Now, Hall Woodhouse is a business that's been around for almost 250 years and is still run by the same family, which makes it actually incredibly unique in the world. And they've been brewing Badger beers, Badger ales, since the very beginning. In fact, not many people could say it was the Napoleonic Wars that gave them their first big break, as they found an opportunity to brew for the army, where everyone needed a couple of pints a day to keep them on their feet. So yeah, Hall Woodhouse has around 150 pubs across the south, all the way from Devon to London and Sussex. Split across managed properties and tenanted, or business partnerships as we call them. And yeah, we brew Badger beer out of Blandford in Dorset and have done for, like I say, several hundred years. And just under 3 years ago, we launched our craft beer brand, Outland. And it's been quite the journey ever since, it's fair to say.
Quite the journey, and one that we're going to dip into as well.
Yeah.
I suppose the first question that comes to mind about all of this is, though, why release it as Outland and not underneath the Badger name? Because I would assume the most logical thing is just like, well, Badger is established name, let's just do Badger Keg range or the Badger craft range. But you've gone Outland, so why did you do that?
Well, we did a big piece of research to set up the entire project and get a real idea of the consumer in the two different categories, and the market, and how they understood Badger as a brand in and of itself, and whether that was the right way forward, if that makes sense. But really, it kind of comes down to that consumer point I think we're going to touch on throughout this podcast, which is, while beer drinkers are relatively promiscuous across subcategories, not my word, the words of the IGD, who are a serious business, and drink across lots of different categories. There are distinctions, and there are different people in those different categories, and so you do need to present a different face to each of them. Having said that, we put a lot of time and effort into the positioning work of Outland as a new brand, and we thought it was important not to give up on our history and our roots, but we wanted to use that as a springboard for the future rather than a sort of anchor to the past. If we just created a brand out of thin air, put it up on the shelf, there's no credibility, there's no history, and let's be honest, people would know, people would find out, and then they'd go, oh, look at these guys, you know, they're dad dancing at the disco, they're pretending to be something that they're not. And you know, craft, certainly when it started, was all about credibility, and so we thought it was really, really important to find that balance really between the two.
Dude, first off, I want to defend Dad Dancing at the Disco. If I could do any better than that, I would. But hats off to anyone who's even got the confidence to go and try and throw some shapes out there without putting
If I'm ripping it up on the dance floor, then take me home because I've had one too many. That's the tipping point. That's when you know.
When you're just busting out a John Travolta across the floor, exactly. And the kids are going, please, someone take them away.
Yeah.
Back on track, Tim. So we were talking about different consumers, or you said you actually did the research, which is music to my ears, someone who hasn't operated on gut. But I've got to know, there are stereotypes between a cask drinker and a keg drinker. In the research, did those stereotypes come to fruition, or did you discover other nuances that you were like, oh, very interesting? And if so, what are they?
I think both are true. You know, stereotypes exist for a reason because they have come from some truth. It may be exaggerated, it may change over time, but there's something in there. And there's definitely a difference between the cask and ale drinker and the craft beer drinker, as it were, and what they're looking for in a brand. And I don't just mean in the product, but also the packaging, the communication, and everything from A to Z, really. So yes, the cask ale drinker, the PBA drinker, does tend to be a bit older. They do tend to be a bit more traditional, a bit more conservative. All of that stuff that you would expect, really. And that, of course, is part of the problem with that category, because as everyone gets older, they drop out of the category, or they just start visiting less because they have other things going on in their lives, as it were.
Okay, so that makes sense. Did you find any crossover though, where you're like, because I'm talking to people and I can see cask getting a bit of a rejuvenation. You've got a younger demographic who are coming in. Did you see that actually some of those who were more traditional in brackets, Badger drinkers, where you're like, oh, we might be able to move them over into a keg market, and how do we do that?
Yeah, absolutely, and that was part of the whole plan when we launched the brand. Really, was Outland was designed to sort of democratize craft, and the packaging was very, very clear into what each product was. So rather than naming the beers, they were just called the style, whether that was milk stout, West Coast IPA. We had 3 clear sort of tasting words on the front and the ABV front and center, so people weren't picking up something that looked nice, having a couple and wondering why they're falling over their cat, because it was actually 8% and they didn't notice. So we wanted it to be really, really clear to help those people that were coming into the craft category. I think the crossover of drinkers piece is really, really interesting. As I say, lots of beer drinkers do drink across different categories, and I think lots of breweries and actually businesses in all categories are really, really obsessed with pigeonholing people and products and and subcategories. And I don't think the consumer they don't really think about it like that. They have a much, much simpler viewpoint on what they're looking for. So you don't have to get too bogged down in that sort of that categorization.
You have inspired me with the falling over the cat statement. Where I hope that one brewery out there does take their percentage and then equate it to the result of what that means. If 8% is falling over a cat, what's an impy stout at 12?
Yes, exactly. Maybe we need a new scale of things that you will trip over when you've had 2 of these.
Exactly. Small dog, large dog,
yeah,
giraffe.
Exactly.
So you talked about the language there and like breaking down what you were putting on the packaging in terms of, how to separate. But then from actual the visual styles, like Badger went through a rebrand. It doesn't feel that long ago, but it was a good couple of years back now, wasn't it, that you refreshed the brand?
I did the two at the same time. So we did the full refresh of the Badger range while launching the Outland craft beer range at the same time.
Oh, okay. So then can you talk me through the nuances in terms of like visual design as well? What you're trying to achieve with the Badger update to still appeal to that demographic, that
Yeah.
group of drinkers, and then the same for the Outland range.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting one. So Badger was in some ways more difficult because it has an audience, it has people that have a viewpoint, and you need to consider that you don't want to sort of piss off your customer base. But the big problem with PBA and cask is penetration. It's bringing new people in, and a lot of the category cues that are very positive to cask and PBA drinkers, tradition, heritage, history, are off-putting to some younger, newer consumers because they see it as a bit dusty and a bit of an old man drink, as it were. And so trying to find that balance was really, really hard. And the research and the work that we did in the positioning, we found some really key and core things to look at. So people saw the PBA category in grocery as a sea of brown bottles. They found it very hard to find their way around the actual category and understand what each product was. One thing that I always sort of go back to, and aside from the data, sometimes it's the little anecdotal bits that really add color to that kind of research. And there was a piece where a shopper, not the consumer, and that's really important because you've got two people to talk to. If they were in store and they had a box of Peroni on their shopping list and Peroni was all out of stock, they would be comfortable substituting that for another premium European lager. In ale, or PBA, and actually in craft as well, they absolutely didn't feel comfortable doing that because it wasn't obvious what a substituted product would be. What's the same that the drinker is actually going to like? And then they just go, I don't want to get something wrong, and they don't buy anything. So there was a real piece around clarity. And so again, on the front label, we make sure the style is big and clear. We have initial tasting notes at the bottom of the label. So at first glance, you know that something is golden, refreshing with a hint of elderflower. If you want to know more, you can turn it around and sort of read the back and all of that. But we wanted to get that sort of front and center so that people understood what the product was as quickly as possible, because you don't have long in aisle. You've got a toddler hanging off your leg, you're soaking wet from the rain, you're running out of parking, you just want to get out of that neon lit nightmare, and you want to be able to do things quickly and easily. So we wanted to make it really, really simple and bring some vibrancy as well to the category, which is why the Badger range is that sort of plethora of color now to bring a bit of punch to that sort of maroony dark brown category, really.
Dude, that's really interesting, that point about not having the confidence to select an alternative brand in the cask and keg market. Oh, that's got my mind boggling. So that's what you did with Badger.
Yes.
Then you were doing Outland at the same time. So how did your mindset differ? Because you would have, I'd assume, take on certain pieces, like you say, the 3 words and the descriptive pieces, nice and easy. But there must have been nuances and differences because you're then working with a craft range versus, your ale. So what were those differences with Outlander?
Yeah, I think with Outland, there was, again, there's a link between the two because they both have, a decent block of color on the front. We used the sort of black and white broader packaging to kind of slightly hark back to the idea of Badger. There was a bit of a link there. Also within craft, where it's a riot of color, our thinking was that by having a black and white can, actually we're creating our own sort of our own canvas that the front information can then sort of sit on. So a lot of it was about that sort of clear communication piece, and that landed really well with the grocers when we first presented it. They really liked that as an idea because they sort of had some similar thoughts or sort of understood the research and the positioning that we had done. So yeah, they're not a million miles away. Marketing, branding, packaging, all that, it's not massively different from product to product, category to category. Some of the rules are kind of the same, which is, about clarity, about, grabbing someone's interest really quickly, and, giving them the reason to buy at shelf or the reason to explore further. So that's what we were really aiming for.
But what you said there was a really interesting tidbit where, like, in the ale market, you ramped up the color. You had to start shouting a little bit.
Yeah.
Versus in the keg and the craft, you actually tone down because everyone is putting the flaming skulls and vibrant illustrations on.
Yeah.
So that's a really interesting tidbit there. Now, I know when we spoke a couple of weeks ago, you were saying that now Outland, and I said Outlander earlier on. I do
All right, you wouldn't be the first.
I think I've just got Highlander in my head for some
Yeah.
reason. Anyway, you're going through little tweaks and adjustments to the Outland identity at the moment. That would obviously suggest that you're learning, you're looking at the market, and then the things where you're like, that could be better.
Yeah.
Could you share some of those learnings to potentially help other listeners and avoid pitfalls that you maybe went into?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way we planned the original launch and the original packaging, etc., was based on good solid research, and I think we all stand by it. But it was based in the office, in the brewery, and 2-3 years in the market is a very different proposition, and you learn a lot from just being out there and sort of out of your ivory tower. So for instance, the black and white thing that we were talking about just now on paper seemed like a good idea, but actually when you got onto shelf, particularly if the can's got a bit spun around, which is very normal, or they're slightly back from the edge, it actually just made them look a little bit dull in that area compared to or that other riot of color. So I think the important question to ask yourself here is, do you go with the category, or is there an opportunity to go against it and be distinctive? Lots of marketing professionals and very smart people will talk about differentiation and distinctiveness, and that's a core tenet of what we do in this business. But I think finding that balance is really important, because people still need to get those category cues and be sort of intrigued. I did wonder the fact that we got the style on the front, the ABV, we had Badger Brewery written on the front, because again, we wanted that link. Perhaps it was almost giving people too much information. They were actually going, oh, I'm not sure about that style. Oh, they're an ale brewer, and that's too strong, too weak, whatever it is. Therefore, I'm not going to go any further with it. There's no sort of story. Whereas perhaps with something that gives you just enough information that you're not turned off, but leaves enough mystery that you take a closer look, pick up the can, then you feel, the lovely texture. Then you turn it around and get more information. And once you're in someone's hand, you're a lot closer to the basket. So, in that case, there was kind of a big learning, and we're bringing some changes to sort of address that in the future.
So with that in mind, the point about, still having the Badger name on Outland, after these years, for the most part, has it worked in your favor, or has it just added to the confusion from what you found in terms of going, oh, actually,
yeah,
Brewery, maybe this isn't great keg stuff because they're not new and funky and groovy?
Yeah, it's a hard one to answer, and we did some more sort of consumer research this summer, which I think touched on that a little bit. And the long and the short of it is, like I say, we designed Outland to be this sort of category entry point. So for what we kind of call the craft curious, I suppose. And again, it was a solid plan, as it were, 3 years ago. But if you look, the category's changed so much in those 3 years. The amount of investment that's poured into it from some of the big guys and some of the people that have been bought up, etc., means that, and with their coverage in the on-trade and how much sort of mental availability and physical availability they have elsewhere, if you're new to that category, you're going to go with Beavertown. You're going to go with Brewdog because those are the ones you recognise, and it's an expensive purchase compared to other beer subcategories. So actually, what we'd done inadvertently was pit ourselves against the best funded, most established, and most popular sort of brands, I think, in the market. And so what we're trying to do with this bit of a shift is to move the brand slightly to other customers that we think of as like tentative dabblers or cautious explorers. So, they're in the category a bit more often. They're still interested in craft, but they're not at the 12% Imperial Brownie Stout super enthusiast stage. They just want something decent, something a little bit interesting. And that's what we're looking to provide. And the other really important thing that we sort of learned and seems to have changed over those 3 years is where those people are shopping. So the multi-pack bay has grown massively in the last couple of years. There used to just be a couple, and now there's loads and loads and loads. And that's the bay that attracts those curious and those real mainstream shoppers, because it's value, it's volume, it's brands I know. The single sort of 440 cans are for people looking for something a bit different. They're looking for something new. They're looking to explore. And so what we were doing was putting something that appealed to the people going to that bay in that bay. And that's not necessarily, exactly where you want to be. So these are only things you can kind of learn as you're out in the market and you see how things are changing.
I mean, wonderful that you have the opportunity to see what's happening and make adjustments and be like, it wasn't a one shot and you fluffed it. You're there so you can make those adjustments to change the path and course. Let's shine a light back on Badger now, because you went through the rebrand, a slight repositioning and identity update. But how are you? Did it work? Like, is it still relevant? Are you pulling in those new drinkers that you were hoping to because of the changes that you made, or what are you seeing as the result of it all?
So, the hard truth of that is that within the PBA category, that is in year-on-year decline at around 10%. And that's obviously a hard thing to overcome. And so, we've seen some performance ahead of that curve, which is great. We did a bit of work with Kantar, who run panel data rather than sales, and that did seem to show some penetration growth, while actually the category was declining. So I think we take it as a win, but in a very, very hard category, really. So yes, I think it's worked. I mean, I think if you ever go into Waitrose, have us brand blocked in a line or across two shelves, and in that instance, it looks absolutely brilliant. You couldn't do much more on shelf to catch people's eye and get them to consider your brand. But PBA drinkers are they like their favourites quite a lot, so you have to do a lot to get them to switch into a new brand.
And so we've touched on obviously the positioning differences, the consumer differences, and what you did with the packaging. The activation of the two, like how you raise awareness of the two different types of product, is very different as well. I remember us talking, like, I see Outland pop up on socials every now and again. You're doing content creator outreach, but with Badger, you don't see any of that. So what are the differences in the strategies that you're using between the two brands to get in front of the right people?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of pieces there. One is around, hard commercial decisions. Like I say, Badger is the bigger brand by a long way, but does it have the same amount of opportunity in the future as potentially Outland does? And so then balancing your budgets between those two and the forces that are pulling on those, both internal and external, is a real sort of juggling act. With regards to kind of where and who we talk to, there's a really simple way of defining that, and that is that Badger comms are much more prevalent and do much better on Facebook, and Outland is much more prevalent, does much better on Instagram. And as I'm sure you know, the audience on those two platforms is slightly different, with Instagram being younger, bit more vibrant, etc., and Facebook being perhaps for sort of slightly older consumers, which is what you'd expect for a product that appeals to that demographic.
So that makes a lot of sense in the digital side of things. What about physical point of sale, those kind of things in the pubs as well, I suppose? Are you doing anything differently to draw interest around the brands?
Yeah, I mean, in the pubs is a really interesting one because, obviously we've got the cask ales on there and we do seasonals under the Badger brand. And that is probably the focus of our support in the on-trade, because we know, the cask drinker, just like craft, they like newness. They want to see that seasonal beer come through. And those have been particularly successful for us this year. I think by sort of September, volumes are up about 83% on the seasonals last year. And that's because we'd done one more, because we were more confident in it and we'd supported them better and all that sort of thing. But a lot of the point of sale and focus we do put on Outland, because the long and short is there's more margin in keg beer and in craft beer. So actually, as a business, do you want to drive people from keg into cask, or do you want to drive them the other way? So from a purely commercial perspective, keg makes a lot more sense. But then you've got history, then you've got familiarity, then you've got the family that still owns our business, and the person whose dad invented Tanglefoot back in 89, I think it was. I'm going to get that wrong. I'm going to be in trouble. But there's all these different things to balance, and that's always going to be really, really difficult. But we do our best.
Yeah, and I'm curious, like from a training side of things, when you go into the pubs as well, like, are you giving training to those behind the bar where you're suggesting, hey, if you enjoyed this from the Badger range, actually you might want to consider this from Outland because there are similarities, but they're different. Is there any kind of encouragement of flow between the two styles, or is it more, right, you're a cask drinker, you stick with that?
Yeah, I don't think we actively try and move people, but certainly within those categories, we want our team to be able to recommend, support, explain, and that comes back down to the the piece around communication and keeping it simple. So when I first arrived, on the back of all the pump handles were notes for effectively the team that were pouring it, and the notes talked about hops and malt and bits and pieces like that. Now, this is quite possibly an 18-year-old that's going to work there for 3 months over the summer and may have never even drinking a beer in their life. So if they don't feel confident because it's just a few words in saying that, then they're not going to say that to the consumer. So when we put Outland in, on the back of the fish eyes, our West Coast IPA was the first one that went in. Rather than saying, oh, it's got Amarillo hops and it's got a piney, etc. sort of aroma and all of that, I put a note that said, if people come in asking for Brewdog Punk, then they'll like this. Because that's what people are looking for.
Perfect.
And that's what the team can understand. They can easily communicate that, and then everyone's a winner, hopefully.
So it keeps on coming back to this simplification message, really, like get out of your heads of the complex and the brewer mentality, I suppose, and think more, keep it stupid. No, keep it stupid simple. Keep it simple stupid would be the preferred route. So before we delve into that a little bit more, I want to come back to the decline in cask. Like you say, 10% year on year is the statistic, which is terrifying and shocking for someone who loves a bit of cask. Do you think there's any hope of a revival? Could it come back? Can we pull a younger generation in? And if so, how?
Yeah, I hope so, because I love cask beer. I always have. And I'm not just saying that because we brew it. And it's a great product, and I know people talk about it being, trying to get it sort of protected within the UK and all of that. And I think that's a great thing to look at. How to bring it back? I think that's an interesting one. I think there's some good stuff happening. I think what's really interesting about it is actually why do younger people not drink so much? There's lots of reasons, but some of them are price. Some of it is around health, and cask is cheap in the pubs compared to something else, and it can be made in a flavour profile that appeals to a broader audience. It's just that hangover and that idea that everyone has that cask beer is brown, warm, flat, and for my dad. So if we can get beyond that, in some ways it's the perfect drink for younger consumer. It's also really easy drinking because it's flat. You don't get that big gassy feel. So I think there's opportunity, and I love seeing some of the. I had a pint of Siren Lumina on. Actually, I had two on cask the other day. I know they do that on keg as well, and it was a great pint. It was light in colour. It was hazy, like you expect these days from craft beer. It wasn't too. I can't remember what the ABV is, but it's not that strong. And it was a lovely drop. There's no reason why someone that likes keg beer shouldn't enjoy one of those. I think it's just a communication piece. Just got to keep banging the drum that cask is relevant. It is for everyone. There is a range of flavors. It's not just muddy brown water that some people might think it is.
Do you think that craft breweries or keg breweries have a better chance of modernizing the cask brand versus the other way around? Because like you say, Siren, Vernon, Sure Shot, they've all released cask stuff very recently or over the last year and stuff, and it's great stuff. I agree, it's wonderful. But because there's a perception with new and trendy because it's craft, it's keg, do you think they have that better opportunity to pull people over?
Well, the positives on their side is that they don't have the weight of history and the design language and sort of thought, as it were. The negative is that the more traditional cask drinker might go, I've never heard of that brewery. That's a ridiculous name. Of some, where they go a little bit crazy, which is great. On the flip side, the traditional brewer trying to do something more crafty on cask might alienate the traditional buyer, but not win over the other one. I mean, this is the grey area between the two, which I guess is quite difficult. And I think there's something there, but these things take time. Consumer perception takes time. I'm not saying Guinness has ever been a small brand, but
it would have been at some point, right? Surely.
They've got one of the greatest marketing teams who've consistently for 30 years put out world-class advertising and marketing consistently. And I know I think quite a lot of them have been there a really long time, which again is rare in marketing. Lots of people move a lot. And, Guinness was doing really well. And then suddenly something caught the public's imagination, whether it was splitting the G, whether it just looked great on Instagram, a myriad of reasons. But they've done all that hard work for all those years. So they're ready to, profit from something that to some degree, slightly out of their control. And you never know where these things are going to come from. In my previous life, I worked for Jägermeister, and Whisper It. They didn't invent the Jaeger bomb. Actually at head office, they hate it because they think it debases this drink that they've been making for 100 years that takes a year to make, that uses 56 botanicals, which is way more than any gin. It's a quality product, but that consumer movement is what really threw it up into the upper echelons of spirit drinks. And so, if you haven't done the brand building before that, when those opportunities come, you won't be the one that people choose. So you can do what you can do, and you've got to hope, I think, for a little bit of spark and consumer movement as well.
See, now that is a really interesting topic, that idea of the consumer embracing the brand and taking it further than you would have imagined. And I suppose to me that really screams that you can't be stuck inside your head of going, this is what I want to do for my brand. You really have to be on the pulse of what the market wants. That's my interpretation of it. Would you agree, or do you feel a little bit differently?
No, I think there's something to that. I think it's, again, I'm sorry, I'm going to be so boring, but it's that balance. You need to stay true to yourself. You can't pretend to be something that you're not, but you also need to, adapt and, talk the consumer's language, be in the places where they're drinking or where they're eating or whatever it might be. If consumers are moving from traditional pubs to nightclubs, just for example, and you want to sell cask beer, are you going to get some cask in the nightclub? Hopefully, ideally, it seems unlikely, but if you're not there, you're not where the consumers are, but it wouldn't naturally be in your mind for a decent venue, a decent route to market. So it's all about thinking in both directions, really, and putting yourself in the shoes of the consumer, not in your head. As soon as you sign your contract to work for someone, you're not the consumer anymore. You know too much, you're too close to the brand, and no matter what you think, they think something different. And you need, that's why you have to keep talking to them, whether it's just at the bar, so it's anecdotal. If research is expensive, let's be honest, and data is really expensive. So you just have to find those ways, whether it's through your socials, whether it's in person. Anything can bring that little nugget that might just give you a different angle of attack.
My mind is stuck on how you get cask into nightclubs. Like just the you get a fish bowl and someone's got they're pulling
put a sparkler in it, and then someone will pay for it.
A couple of straws, and Timmy
exactly.
Perry passed around the room whilst I can't think of a popular dance tune plays, but that's because I don't know dance music. It doesn't matter. So okay, Giles, let's bring this to a close. You've had multiple years now managing these two brands. What are the key things, what is the key thing that you've discovered that you feel most breweries might overlook when it comes to having, keg and cask offerings?
I think that's a really, really good question. It's a really hard question to answer. I think it's probably about thinking about what you're trying to do from inception all the way through to the consumer. This isn't just about good marketing at the end. It's not just about making good product at the beginning. It's about the entire journey from your brewery, or from the idea of a beer to the consumer. It might be a great idea for a beer, but if it uses really, really expensive ingredients, you may not make any money on it. And that's not ideal, if you see what I mean. If you're not putting decent enough ingredients in, but you're spending loads on marketing, loads of people might try it and then go, well, this is crap. So you've got to line up all those different parts, I think, and be, very commercially astute, but also, pushing this product as hard as you can, wherever you can, and as smartly as you can, because, most of us, we're fighting AB InBev, Heineken, big, massive multinationals who spend more on one F1 weekend than most of us spend combined in a year, potentially. And so, where do you take to the fight to a company like that? Is a really important decision to make.
I've heard it described as like, is the difference between a hobby brewer and a business brewer, isn't it? It's the idea of looking at all the touch points, looking at the whole journey beyond just the liquid. Which is a challenging mindset to adopt, I suppose, if you got into the brewing world where you're just like, well, I just want to make some lovely beer, for people.
Just because you're good at, obviously, teaching is an interesting one like that, because teachers go up the ranks and they become a headmaster or headmistress. That is a political, bureaucratic, financial role. It's not a teaching role. You were good at teaching. And so, you might need to bring other people in, or you might need to, do some training or whatever it is to understand that full life cycle and every little cost. It's not just cost of goods. Where's your transport? What are your distribution? What are your energy? What are your repairs? What are you amortizing? All of that needs to be built in. Otherwise, it'll sneak up at you at some point. I sound like I should work in finance now. I really shouldn't.
No, stick with branding. It's important. If you're in finance, you wouldn't have been on this show. But because you are one of my branding compadres and you talk brand, and I love it when you do. As we wrap this show up, Giles, I want to know, what is the hill that you would die on when it comes to beer branding today? If you had a big old flag to wave, what would you leave the wonderful audience with today?
I think I've touched on this through the interview, actually, and it's something that I always attempt to do. Some people would say too well, and that is to be the stupidest person in the room. So to really think, okay, if I didn't know anything, if I didn't know what an amber beer ale was versus a pale ale, an IPA versus a New England IPA, how do I explain and put out products, communications, packaging that the person that knows nothing will understand? You want to be the expert, but you want to talk in the consumer's language. There's opportunity to delve more into the detail and the stuff you're really proud of. But if you start with that, it's only really going to be those super enthusiasts maybe that understand, are interested, and while they're vocal and buy a lot of beer, it's probably not the big meaty middle of the consumer base, which is pretty mainstream, and they want a good tasting beer on a Friday night at a good price. That's the main things. The fact that this one's got, Solero in versus Mosaic means nothing to. I doubt most people even know what a hop is if you actually went out on the street. So, if you're saying, it's got this hop in, well, what does that do? It's the so what, and really sort of try and think like that. So people understand your product and understand you as a brand as well.
Brilliant, mate. Just love it to bits. So Giles, where can people get in touch with you? How do they follow along? Are you up to anything exciting at the moment? Can people reach out to you? And if so, where?
You can always find me on LinkedIn. If you have any questions or want to get in touch, I'm very happy to pick things up. I'm always excited to meet new people in the industry, whatever they do, really, whatever size brewery or distillery or whatever they come from. Like I say, I think a lot of these points are fairly universal across many categories. But booze is my business, and that's the fun one to be in, rather than dog food or something. No offense to the pedigree people out there.
They're having a wonderful time. It's fine. And you've got dog beer these days as well. There is an overlap somewhere. It's a bit weird.
Well, exactly. We do put a cask out in all our gardens with water in for the dogs. They're very welcome.
I've seen those. Well, Giles, my man, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me this afternoon. I hope those who've been listening have really enjoyed it as well. If you're listening to it later on the podcast, as always, this is me talking from the past to you in the future. How are you? And I need to take a second for a bit of shameless self-promotion, because we're chatting at the beginning of November, because I hold here in my hand a printer's proof of the Branding for Breweries book. And this is going to be available to buy from Amazon from the 1st of December. It is the wonderful gift for a brewer who has everything, and they probably don't know they need it, but it really doesn't cost much. $7.99 is going out there for people. So if you're listening to this before the 1st of December, mark it in your calendar. If you're listening to it afterwards, get onto Amazon, buy one, take a photo and tag me in it, because it would be hilarious to see people actually reading words I've created. Shameless plug over. Giles, my man, thank you once again, buddy. This has been wicked. Everyone else, I'll see you on the other side. Rock on.
Cheers.
That's a wrap on this week's episode of Branding for Breweries. If you got something great from it, hit follow, like, and subscribe on your favorite streaming app. Or even better, leave a review, share it with your brewery pals, or get in touch, because I want to chat to you. Rock on.